Well, thank you, Mary Catherine. That's fantastic. You know, I grew up I'm going to talk a little bit about Wisconsin, but I grew up in the state of Wisconsin. We usually don't have such nice things to say about Minnesota. But I have to say, this is a very inspiring story. And, you know, now...
feelings mutual, usually.
Yes, that's right. There's a long history here.
That's right.
But not in this case. In this case, we all know the mess Wisconsin has at the moment, and just as the time period that you're talking about here, Mary Catherine, from 2010, 2011, right on through probably to today, but certainly through 2013, Wisconsin is a disaster because of Scott Walker's action and the loss of collective bargaining. And if there's ever an example of what the opportunities lost involve, we should hear more about what's going on just across the border. Yeah. And so I use Wisconsin not just to make a point about our good neighbors in Minnesota, but I want to use that as the launching point for talking about the alternatives. And in fact, in some ways, I was very, very disappointed when Scott Walker just sort of melted down, because I thought it would be great if he was in this race for a longer period of time. We could actually put on the table a real debate about collective bargaining, because he was so anti-union and so out front about it that it would have really created the stark contrast where we could really tell the kinds of stories that you just told and some of the stories that I'm going to tell about what we're doing in Massachusetts and what's happening in progressive places around the country and what's only beginning to happen to open up this institution of collective bargaining to the kind of problem solving and open discussion that you so nicely illustrate. So let me put it in context and tell you a little bit about this project called the Massachusetts Education Partnership. It really was motivated by the mess in Wisconsin. I spent my youth learning about public sector collective bargaining as a graduate student, as a work study, or the equivalent of that in graduate student school, working on public sector labor relations. And I saw the power. What first impressed me about this field when I first started to study it and then go to meetings of the local professional association, industrial relations, research association, and others, and I saw the level of respect that the management people, both in the public and the private sector, and the labor representatives had for each other, and the problem-solving potential, and saw it in action in a couple of cases where some crises occurred. We had a firefighter strike in Madison in 1968 when I was still an undergraduate working in the city of Madison's personnel department as a work-study student. I didn't cause the strike, I don't think, but in any event, I saw how that strike got resolved. And yes, the labor relations representative for the city was at loggerheads with the firefighters union leader, but the private sector and the public sector labor leaders in the community came together and said, we can't have a firefighter strike. We can't go on for another couple of days. This is just a public crisis. And they brought in some of their own management counterparts, and they all facilitated a conversation that said, let's get this thing resolved in some way. Not to break the strike, not to have the city accede to all of the issues, but to set a framework to make this happen. That's the power of collective bargaining that we lost now. So in Wisconsin, you all know the story better than I do, perhaps. It's a sad story. I know it from going back there and talking with people and from seeing my relatives and to see people in our communities that I know very well who are so deeply divided by what's going on in that state that they can't talk to each other. And so when you bring business and labor together to try to engage these issues, there's no conversation because they're so deeply divided and they're so angry and people are so frustrated with the inability to solve problems. We can do better than that, and your case illustrates it. So watching this in Wisconsin, from the standpoint in Massachusetts, a good friend of mine and someone that maybe a number of people in the room know. He's a labor economist over at Northeastern University, Barry Bluestone. Barry grew up in Michigan, so we have Michigan and Wisconsin rivalries to talk about. But we both share this deep, deep passion for fairness and for the institutions of labor management relations and collective bargaining. Barry's father was UAW Vice President Irv Bluestone, one of the most progressive labor leaders of his generation. So Barry comes from a strong union background and family. Well, we said, look, there's got to be we can do better than this in Massachusetts, and so we started a conversation with the School Superintendent Association. I happen to know the president of the association, with the head of the AFT and the head of the Mass Teachers Association, the NEA in Massachusetts, the School Boards Association, we call them school committees, but it's the same thing, and said, why don't we look at what we could do together? And so with the support of a pretty hostile foundation to public sector unions in Massachusetts, the Boston Foundation, we did a baseline survey of education leaders, union leaders, superintendents, and school committee members, to see what's the current state of collective bargaining, what's their views on how well it is doing. And those results at that time were pretty dismal. Less than a majority thought that collective bargaining was contributing to improving schools. Only about 40% said that they had confidence that their labor management relationship was going to be successful in addressing the issues in their settings. And so we used those data to motivate the parties to come together. And we created, together with the good relations that already were there in the state between or among the union leaders and the district and state association leaders in education. What we call the Massachusetts Education Partnership, and it has a very simple objective. That is, we want to use labor management relations to improve student achievement and school performance. And we want to use it by bringing state-of-the-art problem-solving methods to bear on the issues of critical importance to the districts, to the teachers, to the students, and to their communities. And so this was formed in about 2011, at the end of the year. And we got funding from the Gates Foundation, of all places, not always the best friend of labor and of public education. But to their credit, the Gates Foundation said, you have a good idea and we're going to let you alone. And they provided support. The AFT provided some support from your innovation funds. The NEA provided some support. The state education department provided some support. And we've put this program together to say, how can we really work on these issues in collective bargaining, and how can we work on these issues on an ongoing basis? And so what this partnership has done since then, we've now reached about a third to a half, depending on how you count it, of the districts and the leaders in the state of Massachusetts. We hold an annual conference. It brings about 200 to 300 people from the districts and local unions together to talk about these issues, to get training on problem solving of various sorts and so on. But that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. There's two critical activities that we sponsor. One is training in interest-based negotiations. Very simple problem-solving approaches to negotiations. What Mary Catherine described is certainly problem-solving and more by reaching out into the community. But this is using a set of tools that I know a lot of locals are using around the country, but that help us to identify in a more open and problem-solving way what are the critical issues, what are the priorities, how do we address these in a very inclusive kind of way. And then we also provide teams to go into specific districts to address critical problems on an ongoing basis. So it's more of a task force approach and helping them to identify whether it's professional development or it's putting in a peer-assisted review process or it's addressing leadership development among up-and-coming leaders, both on the local union, in the local union or in the district, or sometimes in combination. The districts pick their issue and then they come to us and say, can you provide a facilitator to help us get started and help us train each other and work with us on these issues. And so we were determined that we could demonstrate that by working together we could solve problems more effectively than by disparaging teachers and public sector workers, breaking collective bargaining agreements, destroying solidarity in local unions, and all of the other messy effects of Scott Walker in Wisconsin. We've now been in business essentially for going on 4 years, really 3 years of activity, and we've now trained about 50 districts in interest-based negotiations. Most of them have reached agreements. Some are because we train some each year. We've got about 13 that are in ongoing negotiations right now, and will obviously be hopefully coming to a conclusion sometime in the next few months. We've been very active in about 12 districts with this much more intensive problem-solving process, and I'm going to talk about one in particular in a moment. But when we look across what's happened in Massachusetts, we did a follow-up survey that's discussed in the little report that's in your packet. You could see the visible effects on the views of superintendents in particular, and some school committee members. They're a little bit harder to reach and they aren't as directly involved, but the school superintendents' support for or confidence that their institutions of collective bargaining was up to the task in addressing school-related issues went from about 40% to 77%. That's a big change. The biggest change was in those districts where we had been doing interest-based training and negotiations. And so those were much more collaborative in negotiations, and that collaboration carried over to the ongoing day-to-day relationships. Now, not all of that is due to just what we did. There were a lot of other things that were going on, and that's why I started with my first impressions in this profession, where people with different interests had respect for each other, knew each other, could solve problems. That's going on at the state level. It's not just our intervention. We built on a foundation of mutual respect. You could see the respect that the Superintendent's Association president and the School Committees Association president and the two teacher union leaders had for each other, because they had dealt with some tough political issues. They had dealt with some hostile political efforts to try to limit tenure, to impose strong single solution teacher evaluation systems and so on, and they had negotiated at the state level to work these things out, not to ignore them, because the public was saying, you know, we've got to deal with some of these issues maybe more effectively than you've dealt with in collective bargaining or in past practice, and so we're demanding change, but these parties could sit down because they respected each other and work out reasonable agreements to move forward together. And that foundation allows you then to go to the district level and to have some confidence to move forward. And I think that's why we have been able to be more successful in Massachusetts. But let me just illustrate it with one example, and then add a couple of concluding kind of general points. When we started this, everybody, and I mean everybody, said, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you're doing this. This is fantastic. Just stay out of Boston. Boston's a basket case. It's a terrible labor management relationship. They can't do anything, and you'll just waste your time in Boston. And you know, I live close to Boston. I'm in the community. I've dealt with public sector labor relations with the firefighters and with the transportation department, some really tough issues that we worked through. And so I know something about the labor relations in Boston. And I knew particularly, even though I had never been involved in teacher negotiations there or teacher labor relations there, that it really was. There was no exaggeration. The parties were very adversarial. The public persona of the AFT in Boston was terrible. And that's, I don't say that as an accurate statement. That's just the way it is. And the Boston Globe, you know, would always be attacking Richard Stutman, who's the president. The Boston Foundation, which supported that initial study, was always critical of what was going on. In fact, they wanted us to intervene and tell them that they should resolve their differences. And Barry Bluestone and I said, I don't think that it would make much sense for us to write some silly op-ed that would tell them what they ought to do. But in any event, after we were at this for about 2 years, one of the big issues that they had failed on in negotiations, in the last 2 contract negotiations, was to add more time to the school year. Boston had a 6-hour school day for elementary and middle school. Well, they don't have middle school, but elementary school days are relatively short. Some people said shortest in the country. I'm not sure that's true, but it was short. And they had tried a couple of times, and in the last one, they even left $9 million of federal funding on the table because the city and the schools department and the teachers couldn't get it together on a fateful weekend. So there's a lot of bitterness. And since I knew some of the folks in the administration and had met Richard once or twice before, started a conversation just quietly and said, you know, I wonder if it would make sense if we just sat down and talked about these issues and see where it goes. That was under Mayor Menino in his final year. And we started, but we got nowhere because about after the second meeting, the mayor announced he wasn't going to run again. And so we said, well, it doesn't make much sense. So we essentially, and then there was the Boston Marathon tragedy. So we essentially waited. But as soon as the election of a new mayor, Marty Walsh, the day after it, I wrote to Marty, who I had encountered in another negotiation, not a particularly friendly way, but we knew each other, let's put it that way, and said, you know, we had these conversations. If you want us to continue, we'll do it, and we'll do it quietly. And he agreed. He said, go ahead and see what you can do. And basically, to make a long story short, it took a year. But it was a year of intensive problem-solving, data-driven, quiet, respectful discussion. And you could see again that Richard Stutman and his counterpart, the acting superintendent at that time, because the superintendent also resigned, John McDonough, these two people trusted each other. They knew each other. They had been through all kinds of issues together. John was the chief financial officer for the district, so he knew the numbers, he knew the data, he knew the district very well. And you could feel that we were going to get this done at some point. And between those two and just facilitating in a problem-solving way, within about 6 months, we had a blueprint for adding about a month to the school year, all in terms of 40-minute increments. But if you added it all up, it's a month. And they had included in that professional development time, as well as a process to figure out how we're going to use this additional time, not just to throw it on there, because all the evidence that you all know better than I do says unless the teachers really are engaged in a process of figuring out how to use this time creatively and effectively, it's not going to pay off in significant ways. And then we just had to wait a little bit. And we had to wait for the politics to kind of get clarified. And we had to wait until the mayor, who was sort of watching this process at a distance, but we're keeping him out of it so he didn't have to, because if it would have been a public process, in this case, it would have been blown out of the water by the Boston Globe or the Herald, for God's sakes, as soon as they heard about it. And so when the mayor was ready in the fall, and he had dealt with some other labor issues, we could then get them, the superintendent, Richard Stutman, the mayor, to sit down to kind of close the deal. And just before Christmas of 2014, it was announced. And it was announced to great fanfare with the three of them and the Boston Globe endorsing it. The Boston Foundation saying nice things, the first nice thing I think they've ever said about teacher labor management relations. And it set in process a change in the relationship. So now they're preparing, and in fact they're now starting negotiations over their new contract. They also have a professional development process going on through our district capacity project that followed this effort. They're doing it largely on their own with a little bit of facilitation from us, but they're moving forward on it on their own and just reported out to the school committee on their progress. And they're talking about how to use, they won't probably call it interest-based negotiations. Those terms for some people are a little bit jaded. But right. They will use the tools of problem solving. They are already using them because they've learned some things about how to negotiate more constructively and more positively. This, I think, to me, just reinforces the power of collective bargaining at its best. The story of St. Paul, the story of Boston, a tough environment that I think is on its way to transforming itself to a more problem-solving environment, not only on the extended school day, but on professional development. Not only on that, they've got some big curricular issues. They certainly have diversity issues that they are working on. They have a whole series of other problems that need to be addressed. So what does this mean? Let's put this now in a larger context. We've got to we've got to get back on the public agenda and get back on the table the value of collective bargaining for this society. We have an opportunity in this election to stand up and say, it's not just the collective bargaining process you have in your image or in your mind in the media or in the history of intensive adversarial relations. There are times when that's called for. There are times when that's going to happen. We've got to stand up, or one side has to stand up for what they really feel is critical and important. And that's part of the process as well. But there's so much, such a richer process out there today that is embodied in collective bargaining. And you heard it from Mary Catherine. It's problem solving. Mm-hmm. It's addressing let's figure out what our critical problems are. It's data driven. It's getting the information on, well, what are the other districts doing? How is this working? What makes extended day work? It's not just adding minutes to the school day, it's adding time, obviously, but then engaging people to figure out how to use that time. And that combination is what seems to drive performance. It is partnership. One of my dear friends, a former student who's at Rutgers University, Saul Rubenstein, has done the best work on labor management partnerships, and he's documented through AFT locals that partnership produces higher rates of improvement in student achievement, and that it builds leadership and it builds a network of communication that spans across districts and that has a diffusion effect in improving education far beyond the boundaries of the particular district. That's the best work in this field that I know of, and we should be out there just talking to everybody about it and making sure our political leaders are talking about it. Third, so it's problem solving, it's data driven. Third, it's partnership. Fourth, it's transparent. And that's why I loved your example, because now, we recognized in Boston that when this was ready to be announced, there had to be a campaign with it. It wasn't magic that the Boston Globe endorsed it the day after it was announced, there was some quiet work. Yeah. And it wasn't, I'm not saying I did the quiet work. We suggested that, but we didn't have to tell these professionals that. But they worked with the Globe. They worked with the Boston Foundation. We reached out to a couple of other key groups to say, you better understand what this is all about and look at what they are doing. And so using the media in a positive way to tell a positive story, but to give them the information that they need is very powerful. I saw the reverse of that not just in the teachers, but in the firefighters, when an arbitration decision went really bad on drug and alcohol testing. And the public just lambasted that arbitration decision. And we had to, I wasn't the arbitrator, but we had to find a way to address that issue more effectively to get the arbitration agreement ratified by the city council. Because there was no way they were going to ratify it with the public saying, you mean we got to pay to have firefighters come to work clean and sober? That doesn't make any sense. Didn't make any sense to my wife, who happens to be a nurse who deals with that population. Mm-hmm. And I tell her all the labor relations principles that might be at stake, and she just wouldn't hear it. And she's not unsympathetic to these issues. And if it didn't pass muster with my wife, then I knew we were in trouble. But the point is, we are in a public world now, and the media can be either our biggest enemy or our greatest ally if we use and recognize that no collective bargaining negotiations is any longer a private matter. It is a public issue, and we have to treat it as a public issue. And finally, and I think this, you touched on this as well, you engage the membership, you engage the community. You're engaging people who are on the front lines. They are part of the negotiations process. And when you engage them, you often find out that this little box that we're put in for mandatory and non-mandatory issues, they never heard of that.
Right.
That's not their problems. That's some lawyer's problem. And by engaging people with their real problems, you can put them on the table and say, well, maybe they're outside the traditional realm of labor relations, but the traditional realm of labor relations is now expanded. And so if we become public about this, we talk about how we can solve problems together, we can talk about how we'll be willing to look at the evidence and be data-driven or evidence-driven, we'll be transparent about what we are doing, we'll engage the people, the stakeholders who have the most direct experience and concern about these issues, and will take on whatever issues happen to be most critical to these stakeholders, then I think we can stand up and say collective bargaining is an institution that not only has had a glorious past in the United States and in the public sector and in the private sector, but it has a very, very important role to play in the future. And I don't think that message is getting out. I don't think it's yet part of the political discourse in this election. I think it ought to be. You all have the capability and the experience and the knowledge and the connections to at least candidates that will listen to this, both at the national level but at the state and local level. And I think we ought to get that story out. And I think that's where we can rebuild collective bargaining across this country in a way that meets the needs of our students or whoever we're serving in terms of the public, meets the needs of your members, and just makes good common sense. And that's what the Midwest is all about, good common sense.